Today, I would like to read you a chapter from a book that I very much liked. It is a book called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Counterintuitive Approach to Living a Good Life, written by Mark Manson. He's an American author, and this is one of he's not a professional author, I don't think, but he did this is one of his books, one of his most renowned books. So let's start. The title of the chapter is called Happiness is a Problem. So let's begin. About 2,500 years ago, in the foothills, Himalayan foothills of present-day Nepal, there lived in a great palace a king who was going to have a son. For this son, the king had a particularly grand idea. He would make the child's life perfect. The child would never know a moment of suffering. Every need, every desire would be accounted for at all times. The king built high walls around the palace that prevented the prince from knowing the outside world. He spoiled the child, lavishing him with food and gifts, surrounding him with servants who catered to his every whim. And just as planned, the child grew up ignorant of the routine cruelties of human existence. All of the prince's childhood went on like this. But despite the endless luxury and opulence, the prince became a pissed off young man. So you would imagine that someone who's given wealth and someone who has never struggled would become problem free, right? He would or she would become, very, very blessed about the world. But it turned out that the prince was not happy. Quite the opposite. He was very upset about his life because the book then went on to write. The problem was that no matter what his father gave him, it never seemed enough, never meant anything. So when you have everything that you didn't struggle for, no matter how much you have, it will feel empty. It will feel meaningless because everything was handed over to you in a silver platter, right? You didn't struggle for it, right? So late one night, the prince snuck out of the palace to see what was beyond its walls. He had a servant drive him through the local village, and what he saw horrified him. For the first time in his life, the prince saw human suffering. He saw sick people, old people, homeless people, people in pain, and even people dying. So this prince, having never been exposed to any kind of suffering in any shape or form, is now exposed to a world of suffering, right? And he realized that suffering is actually the norm, not the exception. And all this time, the prince was the one that was deceived and was tricked into thinking that there was no suffering in this world because of his father's decision. The prince returned to the palace and found himself in a sort of existential crisis, not knowing how to process what he had seen. He got all emo about everything and complained a lot. And as is so typical of young men, the prince ended up blaming his father for the very things his father had tried to do for him. It was the riches, the prince thought, that had made him so miserable, that had made life seem so meaningless. He decided to run away. So this paragraph is saying that the prince, having never been exposed to poverty, to human suffering, did get exposed to these horrible things for the first time in his life. And he blamed all his miseries, the fact that he finds no meaning in life, the fact that he found everything to be pointless, right? He blamed all that, all his emotions, to the fact that he was spoiled and the fact that he was rich and his father was rich. So he decided to run away from the environment in which he grew up. But the prince was more like his father than he knew. He had grand ideas too. He wouldn't just run away. He would give up his royalty, his family, and all of his possessions and live in the streets, sleeping in dirt like an animal. There he would starve himself, torture himself, and beg for scraps of food from strangers for the rest of his life. So instead of thinking, so now that he blames the riches of his life for all the sufferings he had to that point in his life, he wants to do the opposite. He wants to give up his royalty. He wants to give up his wealth. And he wants to run away from all this. But what he didn't realize, and later you will understand what this means, what he didn't realize is that he's more like his father than he thought, right? His father had these grand ideas that his son, the prince, would never suffer a day in his life, right? But the prince decided to do the opposite. He decided he wants to suffer. He decided he wants to sleep in, quote, dirt like an animal, right? He wanted to live in the streets. He believed by doing this, he will be happy, right? Because obviously the riches, the wealth, all that wealth, the suffer-free lifestyle did not grant him the privilege of being happy all the time. So he decided that the opposite is the answer. He decided doing the opposite, living on the streets, getting spat at by passerbys, getting despised by strangers, and begging for food. That is how he's going to feel happy. He felt by doing this, he was going to cure all his problems. All right, he was going to fix all his problems. So the next night, the prince snuck out of the palace again, this time never to return. For years, he lived as a bum, a discarded and forgotten remnant of society. The dog shit caked to the bottom of the social totem pole. And as planned, the prince suffered greatly. He suffered through disease, hunger, pain, loneliness, and decay. He confronted the brink of death itself, often limited to eating a single nut each day. A few years went by, then a few more, and then so up to this point, you would think that the prince is now living the opposite of what he would later consider a privileged life, right? He's now actually living the opposite of it. And a few years went by living this way. What happened? Nothing happened, right? The prince began to notice that this life of suffering wasn't getting him anywhere. That this life of suffering wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. It wasn't bringing him the insight he had desired. It wasn't revealing any deeper mystery of the world or its ultimate purpose. In fact, and here's an important bit, the prince came to know what the rest of us had already known, that suffering totally sucks. Suffering itself sucks. And it's not necessarily that meaningful either. As with being rich, there's no value in suffering when it's done without purpose. And soon the prince came to the conclusion that his grand idea, like his father's, was in fact a fucking terrible idea, and he should probably go do something else instead. So the prince was totally confused, right? Before, he thought that being the rich person, that's the reason why he was so miserable all the time. So he did the opposite, right? He lived on the street. He begged for food, right? He lived like an animal, in the dirt, on the street, homeless, suffered hugely. But what did he find? Nothing really happened, right? Because and this is when he realized that suffering itself, just like being rich without doing anything, just like getting handed everything on a silver platter, doesn't mean anything, right? Either ends, they don't mean anything. So he was totally confused. The prince cleaned himself up and went and found a big tree near a river. He decided that he would sit under that tree and not get up until he came up with another grand idea. As the legend goes, the confused prince sat under that tree for 49 days. We won't delve into the biological viability of sitting in the same spot for 49 days. But let's just say that in that time, the prince came to a number of profound realizations. One of those realizations was this, that life itself is a form of suffering. The rich suffers because of their riches, and the poor suffer because of their poverty. People without a family suffer because they have no family. People with a family suffer because of their family. People who pursue worldly pleasure suffer because of their worldly pleasure. And people who abstain from worldly pleasures suffer because of their abstention. This isn't to say that all suffering is equal. Some suffering is certainly more painful than other suffering, but we all must suffer something nonetheless. And years later, the prince would build his own philosophy and share it with the world. And this would be its first and central tenet, that pain and loss are inevitable, and we should let go of trying to resist them. The prince would later become known as the Buddha. And in case if you haven't heard of him, he was kind of a big deal, right? So let's recap what has happened up to this point. So the prince was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? He didn't have to work for anything because his dad decided it would be a great idea to hand his son, the prince, a problem-free life. That he has decided that this son will not suffer anything in his life. But did the prince feel happy? Did he not suffer? Actually, no. The freedom from suffering itself is a kind of suffering because the prince did not feel meaning in anything that he was given. He felt as though nothing mattered, and that has caused him a great amount of misery. And one day, the prince decided to venture out of the comfort zone, to venture out of his castle, and went to see what normal people were living like, right? And he saw lots and lots of worldly sufferings, right? And so as a result, what he did was he had decided that first he was very shocked, right? He was super shocked about what he had seen. And secondly, he had decided that he was going to live the opposite of what he had lived so far. Instead of the riches, he's going to embrace poverty because he had decided that the riches was the problem. He had decided that the freedom from suffering was the problem. So he had decided to do the opposite, living on the street, begging for food, and suffer through all the sufferings that can possibly exist, right? But the end result was that he only realized that suffering without any purpose is meaningless, right? So both ends, both extremes, the freedom from suffering, the freedom from any pain, and the abundance of pain, right? The experience of suffering itself, they are both meaningless without purpose. So he was very confused. The prince was very confused, right? Then he realized that actually suffering is actually the constant, no matter what. As long as you are alive, you are have to going to suffer something, right? You are going to have to suffer something. People with family, they suffer because of their family. People without a family suffer because of their lack of companionship. People who are rich suffer because of their wealth. People who are poor suffer because of their poverty, right? So let's continue reading the book. There's a premise that underlies a lot of our assumptions and beliefs. The premise is that happiness is algorithmic. So what algorithmic means is you can do something, right? You can do A and B will happen, right? That is called algorithmic, right? It is calculated. It is if you do something. So let's say if I clap, then my hands will make a sound, right? That is algorithmic. So a premise that underlies a lot of our assumptions and beliefs is that happiness is algorithmic. If you do something, you will be happy. That is the assumption. We assume if we have a lot of money, then we'll be happy. If we have that girlfriend or boyfriend, we will be happy. If I have that house, if I buy that house, I'll be happy. If I own that car, I'll be happy. Oh, if I speak that second language, I will be happy. If I travel to this country, to this particular place, I will be happy, right? If I get accepted to law school or building a very successful company, I will be happy. And this premise itself is the problem. Happiness, you see, happiness is not an equation you can solve. All right? Instead, happiness is a choice. Happiness is a decision, not something you earn, not something you have to work for, right? Dissatisfaction and unease are inherent parts of human nature, and as we'll see, necessary components to creating consistent happiness. So the author, Mark Manson, argues that dissatisfaction and unease are actually the key to happiness. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Because we feel that we think happiness equals freedom from worries, right? Freedom from dissatisfaction and unease. And they sound like the opposite to each other, right? But it's not the case. The Buddha argued this from a theological and philosophical perspective. I'll make the same argument in this chapter, but I'll make it from a biological perspective and with pandas. So the author is going to give you an example, right? Using pandas. If I were to invent a superhero, I would invent one called Disappointment Panda. He'd wear a cheesy eye mask and a shirt with a giant capital T on it that was way too small for his big panda belly. And his superpower would be to tell people harsh truths about themselves that they needed to hear but didn't want to accept. He would go door to door like a Bible salesman and ring doorbells and say things like, sure, making a lot of money makes you feel good, but it won't make your kids love you. Or if you have to ask yourself if you trust your wife, then you probably don't. Or what you consider friendship is really just your constant attempt to impress people. Then he would tell the homeowner to have a nice day and saunter on down to the next house. It would be awesome and sick and sad and uplifting and necessary. After all, the greatest truths in life are usually the most unpleasant to hear, right? So all these unpleasant truths, right? All these unpleasant truths are like bad tasting medicine, right? If you want to feel happy, if you want to feel good about yourself, you have to be honest with yourself. You know, Disappointment Panda would be the hero that none of us would want, but all of us would need. He would be the proverbial vegetables to our mental diet of junk food. He would make our lives better despite making us feel worse. He would make us stronger by tearing us down, brighten our future by showing us the darkness. Listening to him would be like watching a movie where a hero dies in the end. You love it even more despite making you feel horrible because it feels real. So while you are here, allow me to put on my disappointment panda mask and drop another unpleasant truth on you. We suffer for the simple reason that suffering is biologically useful. It is nature's preferred agent for inspiring change. We have evolved to always live with a certain degree of dissatisfaction and insecurity because it's the mildly dissatisfied and insecure creature that's going to do the most work to innovate and survive. We are wired to become dissatisfied with whatever we have and satisfied by only what we do not have. The constant dissatisfaction has kept our species fighting and striving, building and conquering. So, no, our own pain and misery aren't a bug of human evolution. They are a feature. So this paragraph, the author is saying that the fact that dissatisfaction and insecurity, they are the change agent in nature, because in the primitive ages, when our ancestors are still living in the jungles, living living in savanna, they had to fight, right? They have to fight for food, and there's a real risk of getting eaten by a lion, let's say, right? So it is evolutionarily beneficial to be able to have the ability to feel dissatisfied with what you don't have and feel content with what you don't have, right? They are a feature, not a bug. So a lot of people think that dissatisfaction and insecurity, they are a sickness of themselves, and they feel ashamed about this. But in reality, that is encoded in our DNA, right? Pain in all of its forms is our body's most effective means of spurring action. Take something as simple as stubbing your toe. If you are like me, when you stub your toe, you scream enough four-letter words to make Pope Francis cry. You also probably blame some poor inanimate object for your suffering. Stupid table, you say. Or maybe you even go so far as to question your entire interior design philosophy based on your throbbing foot. What kind of idiot puts a table there anyway? Seriously. But I digress. That horrible stubbed toe induced pain, the one you and I and the Pope hate so much, exists for an important reason. Physical pain is a product of our nervous system, a feedback mechanism to give us a sense of our own physical proportions, where we can and cannot move, and what we can and cannot touch. When we exceed those limits, our nervous system duly punishes us to make sure that we pay attention and never do again, right? So the author here is saying that pain itself is not a problem, all right? Pain is just a feedback system. Pain is the feedback system that tells us we have gone beyond our limits, right? So for instance, if you touch a red hot stove, what would happen, right? You would immediately retract your fingers because you feel pain there, right? Now, imagine if that pain doesn't exist. It would only hurt you more, right? You don't retract your fingers. You don't retract whichever body part you are touching that hot thing, right? So you don't retract your and it's only going to hurt you more, right? So the author is saying that pain is, there's no good or bad to pain or to suffering. It's just feedback. Now I'm going to end here because this video is getting very long. I'll continue in this next part of this video series where I read the chapter 2 of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And I will continue to do the rest of the chapters of this book, all right, in my other videos. So bye for now.